Commander Gaming.
Hey, my name's Trevor. I'm a language teacher with a background in applied linguistics, and I want to share some observations.
릴리 씨, 한국말 말할 수 있어요?
Oui, 잘하는데? Théa, tu penses que c'est utile?
Je sais pas.
Moi je pense que c'est plus Little Big Whale. Moi je pense que c'est plus Little Big Whale. Moi je vote Little Big Whale. Ouais, Little Big Whale.
Non, vraiment, c'est vraiment pas moi.
Purple.
Yes,
You very good man.
thank you.
You speak London very well.
I'm from England. Where are you from?
I from yes.
J'ai pas beaucoup bougé à cause du Covid et c'est vrai.
Ouais. Qu'est-ce que tu as fait?
Cette année, je suis beaucoup resté en France et j'ai passé du temps avec ma famille.
If you kill me, пошел. Если хотите, мы тебя, блядь, уебало.
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Gracias, sí murió una. Gracias.
Ah non, je pense pas. Mais oui, mais parce que. Bah, oui, mais,
I can't believe I accused someone in French!
Like Merrick, for example, one of the Auto Pump guys, he always talked about how adventure games were a big part of how he learned to speak English.
I've talked a lot. He's
a really proficient English.
Yeah, on the adventure games I come from.
If you want to find someone to practice your target language with, join our Discord. Play games, learn languages.
I invited some friends to come help me illustrate some of this. Because it's fun.
Friends.
So, these are my friends. This is my friend Darla.
Hey, I'm Catalina. Hello.
I'm Brett. Can you give like a quick rundown of like your linguistic background?
So I'm from Colombia and I studied in a bilingual school since I was 5. So basically the curriculum of the school had like half subjects in Spanish, half in English. So all my life I just grew up with both languages at the same time.
I am from Los Angeles originally. So my first language is English. My mom's first language is Romanian. And then she learned German when she moved to Vienna. We didn't learn any German because my dad doesn't speak German. And when I was 6, we moved to Mexico. We moved to Guadalajara. My parents are both teachers and they're bilingual teachers as well. And they taught at the American school there in Guadalajara.
Okay.
So I went to a bilingual school from the age of 6 to 11. And actually in university, I studied Spanish, like linguistics and language studies.
And then I was in the States after university for about a year. So I think that's where it also kind of cemented as well.
So before you went to university, how was your Spanish? Would you say that you were fluent already?
Yeah, I think I was fluent already.
I'm from Virginia, started taking Spanish classes in like lower school, like 4th grade. So it's like 10 or 11 years old, I guess. And just really like picked up on it and pretty liked it a lot. And then in high school, I did like AP and IB Spanish. And
I was taking Spanish in high school as well.
Right.
But it wasn't like, it didn't feel, I was speaking just because I knew it sounded right.
But I really cemented it when I did like some study abroad programs. So I did in high school a month in Spain in the summer, and then in college, a semester in Santiago, Chile. And I also continued studying Spanish in college as a minor.
And I think post high school into university and living in Madrid and now in Mexico, I'm able to understand more of like the grammar and a lot more semantics in general.
Right.
And so like in college, it changes from like learning the grammatical stuff to learning like literature and stuff. So
Just, like, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, but it was a good way to like keep up with the language and yeah. Pretty much cemented though when you go abroad and just have to like either use it or can't say what you want to say.
I think I spoke well. And I always spoke well. I never really had an accent, but
you knew Spanish like a native speaker would know Spanish.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
What works, what doesn't?
So I want to start with a story. So originally, my experience learning languages has been kind of spotty. I have at one time spoken several different languages at varying degrees of proficiency. When I graduated from college, I got my teaching certification in Teach English, and I decided to get a job in Mexico because, as you maybe know, in the language education sector, experience is very important. So I just took like whatever job I could find, and incidentally, I wanted to improve my Spanish, right?
Nice.
So I went to Mexico. I lived there for 1 school year, so 8 months, and then I kind of kicked around in Mexico City for a few. I was in Chiapas, and then I kind of bopped around here for a while. And my Spanish definitely got better, but like not a lot better. Like when I came here, it was probably A2. When I left, it was like B1.
Okay.
Right? Like, so it improved. Like I got a lot of practice, but I wasn't a Spanish speaker, a proficient, confident Spanish speaker in any meaningful way.
Was it because you were hanging out with like other English speakers?
Well,
most of the time?
not quite. Most of my friends were just kind of normal Mexican people. Some of them spoke English, some of them didn't. But my work was all in English. Of course, I was teaching, right? So at least 8 hours of my day were reserved for only using English. And other than that, in the normal week, there were not really a lot of unique problem-solving situations where I had to work through using Spanish. Like generally, I had a routine, you know what I mean? Like, so I had stuff that I could do where I like, if I need to buy something at the grocery store, like I had that nailed.
Yeah.
Right. But I wasn't ever I just wasn't getting there because I wasn't having those experiences. Right. Because most of my day was dominated by work, and then I was tired and I went home. Maybe I hung out with friends, but it just wasn't as engaging. So interestingly, while I was here in Mexico City, I went to a music festival and I lost my passport, my wallet, and my phone all in one day.
No! Terrible. Okay.
So, and I wasn't able to, because I didn't have my birth certificate with me, I wasn't able to actually get a replacement passport here in Mexico. And I had already applied for a job in Russia. So I was like in trouble because I had to apply for this Russian visa and I suddenly didn't have a passport. I had to find my birth certificate, get that sent to me, then get my passport, and then finally apply for this Russian visa, which is like a hassle in itself.
Yeah.
And then maybe I could go to Russia, right? I basically had to go back to America kind of unexpectedly for about 6 months.
Okay.
Right before I went to this next job. And I expected my Spanish rather to decline during that time. I was here in Mexico, you know, immersed. And then I was going back to America to kind of like just wait around for 6 months until I was able to get this Russian visa. While I was there, obviously teaching English is not as much of an option in the United States because obviously most people in America already speak English. So I was working as a cook, which is what I had been doing in university, right? And I got a job actually, very luckily, at this pretty fancy kind of Mexican restaurant. So I was suddenly working in an environment where there were it actually wasn't a lot of Mexican people. It was a lot of Latin American people. There were Cubans, a few Mexican people, Central American people. And then I had a chef from Peru. I had another colleague he was American, but he was Dominican. So he also spoke Spanish. So interestingly, my Spanish did not decline. It significantly improved, like a lot.
It makes sense.
It was like more immersion.
Right. It was like more immersion. But I think the important thing is that it wasn't just that I was immersed. It was that I had to use it and I was using it in different ways all the time. I was solving problems because in a kitchen, it's like fast. You know?
Were they like helping you learn too?
Not really. Like I had reached a point where like I could make a kind of goofy conversation.
Yeah.
And so after that, it was just kind of like runaway success. Like it was, I mean, now I'm pretty rusty again after 5 years of living in Russia, but at that moment, like I was highly proficient. Like I could really go off in Spanish in a way that I definitely couldn't 6 months earlier when I left Mexico.
Yeah, wow.
Anyways, I moved to Russia. You know, I tried to learn Russian many different ways. Russian is a lot more complex than Spanish from the perspective of an English speaker. And I was in the same position as I was living in Mexico. Like I never really got there, you know? I spent 4 years in Russia, and my proficiency now is like A2. I'm like maybe high beginner.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. So the question is why? Like what did I have in the kitchen that I didn't have in Mexico? Mm. You know what I mean? What did I do in that kitchen that I wasn't doing when I was fully immersed, right? Mm. In other words, how can I create a learning environment for myself, which gives me what I need to develop my Russian proficiency now that I will never return to Russia? And obviously some possibilities come to mind, but that's kind of what I'm looking at here.
Useful terms.
Before we talk about that, I want to talk about a little bit of vocabulary. Linguists have a specific way of talking, and they have terms that are very important to them that aren't used in the same way that other people use those same words. Yeah. So first of all, priming. Priming is actually not a language learning term. It's from memory science. Priming is basically the idea that neural connections can help with memorization and retrieval. So memorization is when you put it into your brain. Retrieval is when you pull it out. So let's see what I mean. It's a lot easier to see this when you demonstrate it. This is a little experiment. I'll give 5 words, then you tell me what word you're thinking of. So it's just basic word association.
Okay.
The first one is rabbit, crunchy, vitamin C, dirt, vegetable.
Carrot.
Carrot.
Okay, Brett?
Yeah, I was thinking carrot.
Same thing. Hey, carrot. It's not amazing, but it does illustrate something very interesting, which is that you can see, for example, I'm not describing a carrot with these words, right? Like rabbit and dirt are not characteristics of a carrot in any way. No. So the question is, why does this happen? And how do these words help to kind of get you to that word? So the idea is that terms like rabbit prepare the person to retrieve contextually related terms like carrot, because, to oversimplify things, the rabbit neuron and the carrot neuron have been activated simultaneously in the past and have therefore connected. So if you have two concepts that are kind of lit up at the same time, naturally they say, oh, like we light up at the same time sometimes, let's create a connection. So that next time, if you saw a rabbit, your brain would start getting the carrot concept ready for retrieval in case you needed it.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the result is this kind of network of meanings where you have things that are related to each other by context. This is obviously something with natural kind of native language learning, but also when you're learning a new language, it's like very relevant because it means that context matters. For example, if you're in a market, you're going to be more likely to remember particular words related to that. The interesting thing about this is that it's also relevant to learning new terms. Let's say you don't know the word for carrot, right? But you see a rabbit with the carrot and you know the word for rabbit. You can still create that connection even though you don't know the word. And that priming effect actually activates a kind of empty space in your brain that you can then fill with the word, and the connection is already there. Okay, so this leads to the next concept. So authenticity. Authenticity is the meaningfulness of language use. In other words, an authentic learning experience is one that provides meaning in addition to language forms. So what do I mean by that? In linguistics, the form is the language used to talk about something, while the meaning is the thing itself.
Okay.
For example, the form is the word cat, C-A-T. The meaning is an actual cat. So obviously, every language has a meaning of cat, but every language has a different form for cat. Similarly with apple, right? The meaning is the actual thing. So back to authenticity. Authenticity is the meaningfulness of language use, which means you're not just giving the form when you're learning or teaching, but you're also giving the meaning. You're somehow allowing those neural connections to form by, for example, providing a prop. Instead of thinking about an apple, you can touch an apple, or you can interact with an apple, maybe buy an apple, right? Right. Or to go back to the priming concept, an authentic learning environment is one which provides those conceptual touchstones to reinforce learning. In other words, if you talk about candy in class, your learning outcomes will be less significant than if you talk about candy in a candy shop.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. Because also in class, like they tend to like give you lists of like, if you're talking about food, they give you a list, and then like, how are you gonna remember remember that. It's like 20 fruits on the same day. Like
yeah, exactly. And like you may be able to memorize it, but also your ability to memorize those words aren't going to correlate to your ability to use them in conversation.
Right.
And that difference is authenticity. The candy shop is authentic, whereas the class is not authentic.
Right. Okay.
Which is, and it's not like binary. You could have varying degrees of authenticity. If you brought a bunch of candy to class, then it would be, more authentic. In practice, an authentic learning environment is one which doesn't rely completely on the learner's imagination, in other words.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah,
You're not just using words to describe stuff. You're like, this is an actual computer, right? Or whatever. Okay, so negotiating for meaning. Negotiating for meaning is the act of working together with another speaker to bridge a gap in understanding. So native speakers do this. Whenever there's basically a lack of clarity about something, you stop the conversation, you ask for clarification. Misunderstandings and communication breakdowns open opportunities for negotiations for meaning. When you're a language learner, these moments are actually very useful. The way that we respond to a breakdown in communication is a kind of algorithm which searches out gaps in my vocabulary, for example, right? So if I don't know a word, I'm going to have to work around that. And around that word is going to swirl this vortex of misunderstanding, right? And then when I'm talking to a native speaker, for example, they're going to say, what? Like, what do you mean? Yeah. Right? And that is going to make me focus on that word. And that's when we start negotiating for meaning.
Gotcha.
So let's do an example. Okay. We need some fruit. So I'm going to speak to you in Russian. You just do your best.
Okay.
Дайте мне, пожалуйста, вот это банан.
Do you want a banana?
Banana, I heard banana.
Nice. Спасибо. Scenario number 2. Дай мне, пожалуйста, вот это апельсин.
Definitely an apple.
Okay.
Нет.
No.
Нет. Вот так. Смотри. Апельсин – это круглый и оранжевый. Вот.
Orange?
Вот. Спасибо. Это апельсин. You didn't understand, right? But that actually created an opportunity. It paused the conversation and opened it up for more input. Right. And for a, very small, but nonetheless productive, collective problem-solving scenario. So the fact that you didn't know was actually kind of algorithmically sought out by the conversation and focused upon until you got it.
Gotcha.
You don't have to make yourself negotiate for meaning. This is part of the reason that immersion is also so useful. You don't actually need someone to be a teacher, rather,
right,
to help you learn. And it's actually a very good way to identify your issues, your gaps in vocabulary, maybe failures of pronunciation, things like that.
Optimal learning environment.
So back to our question, what makes some language learning environments work while others don't? And this led me to the Theory of Optimal Language Learning Environment by Joy Egbert, Chin-Chi Chow, and Elizabeth Hanson Smith. These are the kind of characteristics of an ideal language learning environment. So the first one is learners have opportunities to interact and negotiate. Learners interact in the target language. Learners are involved in authentic tasks. Learners are exposed to and encouraged to produce varied and creative language. Learners have enough time and feedback. Learners are guided to attend mindfully to the learning process. Learners work in an environment with an ideal stress anxiety level, and learner autonomy is supported. So let's talk about some of these, because obviously that's too much to really understand at once. So the first one, learners have opportunities to interact and negotiate. Generally, what we're talking about here is obviously interacting with a speaker of the language. They don't have to be a native speaker, right? But generally, they should be more proficient than the learner is. Right. That's all that's really necessary so that they can give the correct kind of patterns that person needs to move up.
And it's just different from listening to a recording and like trying to respond to a recording.
Right. The key word here is interact. Yeah. Right? I say something to you, then you say something to me. We do something, right? And I mean, you can, that's not to say that watching a movie, for example, is like pointless. Because that is also a form of interaction. It's just less, a kind of lower fidelity interaction than what you would have if you're talking to a person and, basically getting confused and stuff. If a learner makes a mistake, they receive explicit or implicit feedback. This is the negotiation for meaning thing, right? So explicit feedback is something like saying, oh, you need to say this instead of that, right? And sometimes that happens when you're talking to like a nice person in their native language.
Right.
Implicit feedback is actually much more common. Implicit feedback is when you say something, someone's like, what?
And they respond like completely different from what you're asking. And
Right.
I didn't ask that right.
Exactly. And the interesting thing about this is that when you talk again about those kind of neural connections, this sets your brain on fire because you're like, oh God, you know, like emergency, you know, you suddenly start firing on all cylinders. Yeah, and then, so even though they're not trying to teach you in any way, that communication breakdown is when the negotiation starts. When you get new input in that situation, it's a lot more productive. Okay, so next concept on the list. Learners interact in the target language. This one seems pretty obvious, but obviously it's extremely important. You need practice, and you need to be practicing in the language that you want to learn.
Yeah.
Right? You need to be using your target language. An ideal language learning environment is one where you don't have a choice, right? Maybe the person you're speaking to doesn't speak your native language, so you just have to kind of like crash through it. Maybe you have a teacher who's just very disciplined and says, no, we're going to continue in this language. But you need to use the language, and you also need to keep yourself in the learning environment by never reverting back. This is a big problem for me, for example, because my wife is a native speaker of Russian, and yet we don't use Russian that much, right? Because it's difficult to find an opportunity that is just the right level of like intensity to merit using a less than optimal communication medium.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is part of the reason that I was successful in the restaurant.
Yeah,
right?
You had to use it.
30% of my coworkers, I had to communicate with them in Spanish. And the other ones preferred to use Spanish to communicate with me.
Right.
So like, of course, I had to do this, and that was like the perfect environment for me to learn Spanish. So the next thing, learners are involved in authentic tasks. So we talked about authenticity already. An authentic task is one in which the meaning is not left to the learner's imagination, and one which has stakes, right? Just like in reality, an ideal authentic task is one where you can fail, and where there's a risk that's going to motivate you to move forward.
You have to get it done because you need something, or you are needing something from somebody.
Right.
Vice versa.
Right. Something other than getting an A in class. Right? You're actually trying to accomplish something. And it doesn't have to be like, you know, end of the world kind of stuff, but just something. Like if I'm in a learning environment where I can ask someone for an object and they give it to me, even that simple interaction has stakes, right? The consequence is that I either have the thing at the end of the interaction or I don't. And this is a kind of difficult balance, because if the stakes are too high, you're basically going to, the stress will probably cause you to fail, and you're not going to learn very much. But nonetheless, it's good to have like a kind of something to work for. Learners are exposed to and encouraged to produce varied and creative language. This is another good reason that like me living in Mexico didn't really work, right? Because 5 days out of the week, most of my Spanish language interactions were the same, you know? Buying something, maybe saying hello to someone, that was like it. So the variability just didn't exist. Whereas in the restaurant, it was like, where's the whatever? And I was like, I don't know what that is, right? So then we had to negotiate for meaning. And so that's a much more kind of fruitful learning environment. Repetition is crucial for mastering semi-familiar language forms, right? You learn a word, you kind of know it, you use it like, I don't know, 10 times, and then you're pretty good with it, and you can like pull it out when you need it. But experimentation is key to learning new language forms. For example, a learner hears native speakers repeat a word in a particular context and eventually decides to try using it without it ever being explained to them. Even among extremely disciplined language learners, most of the language you learn is going to be somewhat osmotic. It's going to be from getting input, interpreting that input to the best of your ability, and then trying to reuse it without anyone explaining to you, like, this is what this word means. And in fact, as native speakers, this is the overwhelming majority of our vocabulary. most of the things that you know how to say, nobody explained to you what they meant. At a certain point, you just start picking up words because of context.
Right.
A great example of this is curse words. Nobody ever explains how to use curse words. We all know how to use them.
Yeah.
No one has ever taught me how to use a curse word. In English, Spanish, French, Russian, nothing, right? And yet, like, I know what they mean and I know how to use them.
Yeah, totally.
So this kind of necessity to not only do what you know, but to do what you don't know, I think is a huge part of actually developing proficiency in a language.
Totally.
Learners work in an environment with an ideal stress anxiety level. So this is kind of what I was talking about. You need a balance.
Yeah.
So too much stress makes you stupid. And you're not going to learn anything if you're too stressed. It just doesn't. Your brain shuts down. You know, you can't have someone yelling at you and expect a learner to like interact effectively in that situation. That said, no stress is actually inauthentic. Stress is a part of language learning, right? And authenticity is very important.
Like a classroom where you're not going to get graded for it or something.
Right, exactly. Or even a really simple interaction with a native speaker has stakes. It's awkward if someone says something to me and I don't know what to say back.
Yeah.
Right? So even that little bit is like, you know, it kind of lights a fire under your ass to like move forward in the conversation and go where you've never gone before.
Totally.
Learner autonomy is supported. A learner is free to choose what they will do next without leaving the learning environment. This is kind of weird because I've never found a class that works like this. I'm a teacher. If I prepare an activity for my students, they're not going to just say, I don't want to do this right now. I would rather do something else. This is too stressful. Like, sorry, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Basically, what you would have to do is say like, oh, I've made this activity, but if they don't want to do that, I've made this other activity. And if they don't want to do that, I've got this other, you know, nobody's going to do that.
Yeah.
I don't have time to make like a whole tree of possibilities for every time that some kid wants to opt out of the activity. And yet, this is actually very important because it is a stress mitigation strategy. If something is too hard, the ability to come back and do it later is like hugely beneficial. So it's a perfect learning environment is one where I can say, no, not right now. But also, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to revert back to English, basically.
Right, okay.
Application.
Okay, so how do we apply these things? What am I getting at here? The thing is that some of these are pretty accessible in a class, but most of them are not. Perhaps an American learning Spanish can facilitate an environment like this under ideal circumstances, right? If you live in a place with a large immigrant population of Latin American people, maybe you could cobble this experience together for yourself. You can find people to talk to in the native language. But even then, you're not going to be able to direct them to like, oh, now today I need to learn about ordering in the restaurant, right? I'm not going to rent a studio and make people pretend to be in a cafe just so that I can learn the words for like how to, I don't know, order a coffee or whatever. And what about an American trying to learn Japanese or, you know, Swahili, right? They're shit out of luck. Like there's obviously all kinds of immigrant communities if you live in the United States, but the idea of putting together one of these experiences is almost none. It's rude as well. Like you're not just gonna be like, hey, you are a Kenyan person. Would you like to come like role play with me? Like it's not gonna happen, right?
I know, even in Los Angeles, like I would want to speak to people in Spanish and they would automatically respond to me in English because they didn't want to.
Right. Yeah, it's not their job.
Right, exactly.
And more importantly, what about a kid in Guatemala who wants to learn Korean, right? What if I live out in the middle of nowhere in Siberia or, you know, in Africa and I want to learn a language? Like that's yet another degree of difficulty. Right? If you live in a remote area, even in a very, very kind of connected country, I'm sorry, it's just like, where are the resources to create an experience like this? And obviously class is not the answer. So how can a learner create a language learning environment with meaningful social interactions with real speakers and authentic tasks with ideal stakes where learner autonomy is supported? So that's a lot, right? That's a tall order.
Yeah.
But we already have the technology to create these experiences. Do you have a guess what I might be talking about?
Like AI bots?
AI generated conversations.
No.
Duolingo?
No, better, way better. So let's keep in mind, I'm talking about interactions with real speakers.
Okay, with real
and
speakers.
authentic
Okay,
narratives.
so using the technology to do, I mean, we would say like, are we saying like Zoom?
Yeah.
Virtual reality,
Like-
augmented reality, like video games.
Video games. Video games are immersive. They're social. Learner autonomy is supported, right? If there's a task where I'm like, I don't understand what he said. Like, I can come back later. I'm able to opt out of particular tasks, which I feel are too hard, but never leave the learning environment. They're addictive. You can play a video game online with other people. You can even find people who are, you know, native speakers to play with. It can be stressful, but not too stressful, because if I die, who cares? There are stakes. The tasks are authentic. They can check all of these boxes.
Yeah.
So this leads me to my next story. I went to Russia. I worked there for a few years. My first job I had for 2 years, or almost 3 years. I was basically an extracurricular teacher for mostly the public school system. After school for kids who wanted some extra English classes with a native speaker. It was really cool because I went all over the city, all different kinds of neighborhoods, you know, fancy private schools, kind of crappy public schools, nice public schools, like everything. The weird thing is, I would go into these classes, and with all of the groups that were over about the age of 12, there would always be one kid who was just already fluent in English. Like, the rest of the class, maybe B1, you know, maybe lower, and then just one kid who's just like going and like didn't need my class. Like, I wasn't gonna say that because I liked having them there.
Right.
Like, and this was a consistent experience. I saw it all the time. Usually it was a boy, not always. It was occasionally a girl, but I would say like 70% of them were boys. And they just, I just knew English. And I was like, why? How did this happen? Because it wasn't from school, not even particularly ambitious students. Like, a lot of them didn't do their homework. I didn't get the impression from their other teachers that they were very disciplined students. So I was like, what is happening here? And when I asked them, you speak English. How do you speak English? And they all said the same thing. Oh, I go home and I play Overwatch with some guys in Finland, like 3 hours every night.
Oh, yeah.
Like they were online, and, you know, for better or worse, you could talk about video game addiction or something like that. It's a real problem. But in terms of the returns that they were getting in their English proficiency, it was enormous.
Interesting. Yeah, totally.
The research.
This leads me to a little bit of research. This is from a compilation of research titled Digital Games and Language Learning by Mark Peterson, Kasumi Yamazaki, and Michael Thomas. Specifically from the previous literature section of a paper titled Gaming as a Gateway to L2 English Learning. This is the initial part of another paper, which I'm actually not going to discuss, but it gives a good rundown of some of the articles that I've read about, like, what kind of research is actually being done on this. L1, L2, do you know?
No.
Okay, because they use that in the terminology. L1 is your first language, L2 is your second language.
Okay. Yeah.
You could go, you know, you could say L5 or whatever, but generally we're talking about L1, the native language, and L2, the target language, the language that you're learning. So this is from the paper.
Said in Turkey, the study by Turgut and Ergin targets 10 to 14-year-olds. Empirical data consisted of interviews and observations of individuals engaged in digital gaming at internet cafes and were analyzed using a phenomenological theoretical framework. The findings indicate that participants perceive their engagement in gaming as beneficial both for L2 vocabulary acquisition and increased motivation for L2 learning.
So this one, not that compelling, because they're saying these learners reported that they think that this probably helps them, right? However, when they report their motivation, that's actually very real, because obviously they can reliably report their motivation to do something. And when you're learning a language, motivation is very important. So even just the fact that they wanted to do it gives it a huge advantage over most homework, right?
Yeah.
But these ones are a little bit more concrete.
The study by Pirinen, Marsh, and Tanio included video recordings of 2 13-year-old Finnish boys engaged in the science fantasy multiplayer role-playing game Final Fantasy X. In this game, lexical and prosodic repetitions are an integral part. Findings suggested that the gamers developed both their linguistic and interactional competence in English. During the game, the players reproduced, practiced, performed, and played with different character styles and accents of English. Specifically, the frequent repetition of language used in the game was found to be linked to the L2 learning of these boys.
So this one also they draw a direct correlation between the actual, like, they played the game, their proficiency went up. They're saying like, okay, these subjects seem to have become more proficient after playing this game.
Yeah.
But obviously it's only 2 learners. So this is more interesting, but still not quite there.
Focusing on vocabulary and spoken language, Sundqvist studied 15 to 16-year-old L1 Swedish students. Data from language diaries and questionnaires investigating students' exposure to English outside of school were correlated with learning outcomes as measured by written vocabulary tests and interactional, dyadic speaking tests. The findings indicated clear correlations between amount of exposure to L2 English and vocabulary and speaking proficiency. However, the strongest correlation was found between productive use of L2 English and activities such as digital gaming and oral proficiency.
When it says productive right there, in this context, we're talking about productive as opposed to receptive, right?
Okay.
So speaking and writing as opposed to listening and reading.
Okay.
Right? So when they say they see a correlation between productive use of L2 in digital gaming and oral proficiency, that makes sense, right? Because these guys are talking on the microphone or whatever, and thereby practicing what they're going to do.
Okay.
Another Scandinavian study, Sledden, Strandbo and Gillier 2015, identified a link between L1 Norwegian students, aged 13 to 16, in and out of school activities. It was found that there was a correlation between the amount of gaming, more than 3 hours several times a week, and final grade in English, but lower grades in the subject L1 Norwegian and mathematics.
So this doesn't mean that they, for example, became less proficient in Norwegian, right? Because we're looking at lower grades. This actually kind of backs up what I was saying before. Like, this is not necessarily because these kids are excellent students, right? And that actually indicates that they are in fact getting it from the video games, right? A kid who maybe improves their English this way, they're not necessarily going to be getting higher grades in other areas because maybe they're not doing their homework or something. Probably playing video games instead.
Right.
But nonetheless, it shows this correlation.
Looking into extramural English gameplay and its correlation with English vocabulary proficiency, Sundqvist and Wickstrom investigated Swedish learners in 9th grade, aged 15 to 16, and found similar links as Sledden et al. Based on questionnaires, language diary data, essays, vocabulary tests and final grades in English, analyses showed a positive correlation between gameplay, the usage of advanced words, essay grades and final grades. It was also concluded that boys engaged to a significantly larger degree in gameplay than girls.
Okay, gender disparity. So a couple of the studies that were discussed here have a disparity in gender. Basically, boys were shown to have exhibited this benefit from playing video games more than girls, which is not to say that boys are just better at learning languages with video games than girls are. The point here is that you see this benefit more in boys, which actually makes sense because video games are unfortunately marketed to boys.
Yeah.
Girls didn't benefit from this probably because they weren't doing it as much.
Right.
Because of some stupid bullshit from the 70s, we think that video games are for boys.
Right.
So even among girls who perhaps do this, you know, they're playing games in English. Maybe boys are doing it for like an unhealthy amount of time every night, whereas girls do it for a normal amount of time. And so they're not getting that same benefit. Nonetheless, the fact that you see this disparity actually further indicates that it could actually be the video games that are doing it, right? Like if you have a sport that's only available to boys in a school, then only the boys will get will gain the athletic benefits of doing that sport, obviously, right?
Is anyone out there?
My point here is actually not that nobody's talking about this, because there's actually a wealth of research about this. But the problem is that it doesn't seem to be being implemented. Scientists have researched it and to some extent substantiated it. In other words, there's a disconnect between the research and the practice of like teachers in the classroom. Right, exactly. Language classes are the same all over the world and they haven't changed in 100 years.
What has changed in language learning since 2003?
Not much. Here and there, yes, there have been changes. There's more comprehensible input than before, but by and large, language teaching is the same as it was in 1945, okay? There's been very little change. And there are good reasons why. How do you find out about it? Well, you can buy books. They're written in, except for mine, they're generally written in what we call tortured prose. You don't understand what the person's talking about. I can't get through them most of the time. Professional journals, the same way. They're also expensive.
Very.
The solution to all this is what is called open access. Getting our stuff out so real people can read it and do it. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen because nobody can afford this.
So that raises my question, is anyone doing this? And the answer is basically no. Like, I've looked around for some kind of, I don't know, some kind of like how to learn languages with video games, because it seems like this is going to be huge at some point. The question is, why is it not already? Because like we have the resources.
Right.
Nonetheless, people just don't do it. Nobody's really interested in it, with a few exceptions. So basically, if you search this on YouTube, you're gonna get probably 3 results. There's a guy, his YouTube channel is called Fingtam Languages.
Hey, what's up guys? Today we're gonna talk about how you can use video games to learn languages.
He made one video about how he improved his French, I think, with Pokemon or something like that. But he didn't really explore it. There's only one video where he just kind of like gives a little talk about it and then like, oh, that's interesting. Most of his videos are about just kind of normal language learning techniques and stuff like that. And then also this guy Metatron.
Learning languages through gaming.
Is a YouTuber. He's also made basically the same thing. He made one video where he was like, yeah, you can do this. Nonetheless, most of his videos on his channel are not about that. It's just one little video. So the one exception that I found is this guy, Gaming Gengo.
Trevor, his channel is called Game Gengo.
This gentleman is an Australian person.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of Game Gengo's vocabulary series. In this series, we go through a different game every single episode that's voted by you, the viewer, and we learn every single piece of language that's covered in this section of the game, with a focus being on vocab.
Highly proficient in Japanese now. He lives in Japan. He is a machine.
Now, we actually have a spreadsheet collecting all of the data of all of the words that we've been learning up until now, as well as Anki decks that go along with it all.
He's like extremely systematic, as you can say here.
Wow.
But
and it's
that's
always with a different game.
Yeah.
No.
You see, he's got like maybe 250 videos on his YouTube, and he does a different game, and he just kind of runs through like an hour of it and explains the vocabulary.
He also has series focusing on a single game and many discussing grammar.
So if someone watches this and they're learning Japanese, I strongly recommend that you go look at his videos. But it's only for Japanese, you know? It's not about the idea of learning languages as much. It's more about like basically him learning Japanese.
That's wild. You could only find one person.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is that like what it seems obvious to me, right? Mm-hmm. Like I can't afford to go to Paris to learn French. I mean, the real goal is to create a kind of online community of people who are engaged in language exchanges with each other.
Join the Discord.
How, like, where else do I get that? And the answer is, oh, okay, I'll find someone to interact with virtually. And instead of just having like a video chat where I can like say like, oh, comment ça va or whatever. Oh, hello, in my country, it's sunny today. Like we can say like, oh, we have to go over there and solve this problem together. Imposing a problem-solving task is so helpful.
Oh, of course, it's like when you talk to friends that are like just moved here and they're learning Spanish.
Right.
They'll always say the first time they're always feeling really comfortable in the language, like, I'm so proud of myself.
Right.
I interacted with the doctor, or I lost my passport and I had to go get it. Like that's when they're like, I had to use it.
Yeah,
and I feel proud of it.
And that's basically what a video game is. It's like, it's low stakes, but it's basically a battery of problem-solving situations. Yeah. And if you have a co-op game, it's even better because you have to say, okay, let's do this together.
Join the Discord.
Sounds really interesting and, like you said, like very accessible. Like, okay, it's not like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna get this to happen? Like people are already playing video games.
Right. Well, and the other thing is that like, one thing I really don't like about language education is accessibility is a huge problem.
Yeah.
Because language learning already is so intimidating. And looking down on someone for having a kind of pedestrian approach to learning the language is just gatekeeping, and it's just preventing people from learning languages,
Yeah.
right? I want language learning to be lowbrow, right? I want everyone to feel totally comfortable,
Yeah.
right? Because
Totally.
that's when you start learning.
No judgment.